The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to 1615's final webinar for 2014. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615 Church Missions Coaching. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Today's webinar will address how local churches in the United States can gain international missions experience without crossing international borders. In this webinar, we will explore how immigration provides Christ followers who live in the U.S. opportunities to gain a biblical understanding of God's missionary task, to experience the strongholds of major world religions, to train for effective cross-cultural interaction, and to be challenged with clear next steps to strategically engage in God's global mission. This webinar is for pastors, youth pastors, church and missions leaders who are looking to mobilize their congregations for their church's global endeavors. We hope that you will not only be blessed by what you hear today, but that you will be moved to take action. Before we get into the webinar, I want to share about a few resources that are available to you online. We recently held a conference in Nashville, Tennessee called the Reduce Conference. It's a one-day conference with a focus on how local churches can reduce the number of peoples cut off from the light of the gospel. All of those recorded talks are available online at 1615.org, again, 1615.org. It'd be a great refresher for your missions team or council, or just a recommendation for people who have an interest in missions. It helps explain the global task, the importance of a strategy, and how to go about engaging those, again, who are beyond the reach of the gospel. How do we reduce the number of unreached peoples? So feel free to visit our website and take advantage of that conference. It is available for free download. And then we have a variety of webinars that have been archived on our website that we've been doing for the last several years, archiving those webinars on a number of missions topics. So once again, if you're part of a missions team at a church and you're looking for good material, valuable content, please visit our website. All of those webinars are available for free download. Again, they're on a number of missions topics and ideas, and we hope that you will take advantage of those resources. By the way, today's webinar is being recorded and will also be available in the next few weeks online. So if you listen to this webinar and it's stimulating and encouraging to you and you want to share it with others, you'll be able to do that by pointing them to our website. Today's subject matter expert is Rick Davis. Rick, I want to thank you for being here today and giving your time for this topic. Rick serves as the Director of Engage Global in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In just a minute, I will hand the microphone over to Rick so he can share, but first, just a couple of details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing questions for the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together. I'm excited to tell you that 50 people are registered for today's live webinar. We did this webinar in October, and there was such an overwhelming response that we decided to offer it again, and I'm so glad to see so many people registered again. This webinar, once more, is being recorded and will be available for download in the next few weeks at 1615.org. I'm going to make Rick the presenter at this point. Rick, again, thank you so much for taking time to share with us today, and I'm sure that you're going to be a blessing to all those people online. So, Rick, take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. It's good to, be here again and speaking with all of you. Thanks for joining in and listening. Just real quick by way of a brief introduction of myself. I've been doing cross-cultural ministry for over 25 years now, both here in the U.S. and overseas. And my journey began with exposure to Southeast Asian refugees while knocking on doors in the city where I grew up. And it was through that experience that God grabbed a hold of my heart with a love for cross-cultural ministry and for the nations. Also, during those early years of my journey, I also took a class called Perspectives on the World Christian Movement, which I highly recommend. It was really through that missions education, through that class, combined with the exposure to cross-cultural ministry and Southeast Asian refugees living in my city. That's what really led to my long-term engagement of unreached peoples. And so I'm still involved in cross-cultural ministry, but now my primary focus is on the mobilization end of things. And so I work with a team to see people get engaged long-term with unreached peoples, wanting to see everyone be involved and many go. And so exciting part of it is that many are going. Research says that in 1989 there were about 120,000 short-term goers that went, but over a period of 20 years, by 2008, that number had grown to 2.2 million. A huge increase in 20 years. So certainly short-term missions is here to stay. Some have called this increase the most significant shift in modern missions. But I think a question that arises is, as people are going and going sometimes year after year on these short-term missions, is it, do these repeated experiences in short-term missions trips increase participants' interest in career missions? Because research also tells us that although many are going on short-term missions trips, not many are going long-term. During that same 20 years, in 1988, there were about 65,000 career missionaries that were sent out by U.S. churches on the field. And in that same 20-year period, that number of long-term career missionaries had decreased to 35,000. That's a huge decrease in the same 20 years. And so I think there might be some strategic factors involved in why those numbers, although increasing in short-term missions, has not translated into long-term career missionaries going and engaging unreached peoples. So some of those factors, one of them definitely is focus. A lot of the short-term trips that go out, because of the limited time of their trip and this need that we need to do something, and then these teams not knowing the culture, language, worldview of the people they went out serving among, out of necessity, the teams tend to focus on building and on projects and the meeting of physical needs rather than on being able to focus on meeting the spiritual needs. And I think as a result, it gives participants the idea that missions is really needs-driven. It's what missions is all about. And so what's happened is we have a very broad definition in people's minds of what missions is, and it begins to include everything that involves going outside the doors of the church. And so those that go, when they return home, though they may have this feeling of being challenged to do something for missions, but they may have not captured the feel for the needs of the lost and unreached, and really the barriers to reaching them cross-culturally. And so if missions becomes all needs-oriented, we won't have people going long-term in obedience to Jesus' commands to disciple all nations. They'll go because it makes them feel good to meet a need. And they'll go year after year and feel they're doing their part. But in the end, we'll have a weak in missions, mobilization movement. We won't see long-term goers going, and we won't complete the task that Christ gave us. I think another strategic factor is certainly cost. Again, estimates tell us that we're spending roughly $2 billion a year on short-term missions trips, and that's more money than is spent on long-term career missionaries. And often we talk about the impact on the lives of those who go on these trips, yet research is coming in more and more suggests that those changes in those lives are many times short-lived. And then we don't talk a lot about the impact on the recipients of those short-term teams, although we can read about them in books. A couple books I would recommend. One is When Helping Hurts, and another one is Serving with Eyes Wide Open. And as we read through some of these books and the results of our trips, we're finding out maybe that we're not accomplishing as much as we think we are. And so with the $2 billion price tag, it makes it essential that we do short-term missions well. Another strategic factor of short-term exposure is the area of hosting. I think a good short-term mission trip maybe is one in which a short-term team can observe long-term missionaries and their work. But long-term missionaries aren't necessarily equipped or have the time to meet the special needs that short-term teams bring with them. Oftentimes, friction develops when these long-term career missionaries feel pressured into hosting short-term teams and maybe need to create something for them to do. And then friction also develops when these short-term teams and long-term missionaries have different expectations about the purpose of the trip and what actually can be accomplished on that trip. And so what happens, I think, sometimes is the team, rather than be a blessing, they become a burden to both the missionary and the work. And this can lead to that short-term team being burned out by their experience. And then in closed countries where many unreached peoples live, this becomes even more difficult. Another strategic factor to short-term exposure is just that the fact of the exposure. If anyone is going to feel called to the world, it's usually going to be where they visited first. And right now, more than 4 out of 5 people that go on short-term teams go to places where there's already missionaries and already churches. And so the outcome then is, as a result, we keep sending more and more short-term teams, but the number of career missionaries is decreasing. And those that are going long-term are going to places that are already reached with the gospel. So the question then is do we give up doing short-term? And I don't think so, but I think we do need to do a better job at connecting the trip to the big picture and mobilize people to be strategically involved long-term in the big picture after returning from a trip. So let's think about the big picture just for a minute. Consider Jesus' last words, at least as recorded in Matthew 28. I think they're often misread. His last words were not just to make disciples, but they were to disciple all nations. That word nations is not talking about countries, but it's rather talking about people groups. It's the Greek word ethnos. We get the word ethnicity, ethnic group. So we are commanded not just to make disciples, but the mandate is to disciple all nations or all people groups. And what is a people group then? It's the largest grouping of people through which the gospel can spread as a movement before it encounters barriers of understanding and acceptance. I like to think about it in terms of the state of Minnesota, where I live. Minnesota is called the land of 10,000 lakes. And if I was to take a rock and throw it into one of those lakes, it would start those ripples. And those ripples would go to the edge of the lake, but the ripples wouldn't jump into a new lake. If I wanted to start ripples in another lake, I would need a new rock. And that's the picture of many countries. The country where I served in Southeast Asia is a country of about 6.5 million people, but more than 130 different people groups. In the province where I served, there were 2 main people groups, the Hmong and the Puan. The Hmong first received the gospel there 60 years ago, but the gospel didn't jump from one people group to the next to the Puan people until 60 years later when a new rock was thrown into that pond and the gospel presented in a new contextualized way to the Puan people group. And so the last words of Jesus were that we enter every people group on earth and see a church planting movement happen of reproducing churches. And so in the world today, there's over 16,000 people groups, and still 7,000 of those are what we consider unreached. An unreached people group is a group of people among which there is no indigenous community of believing Christians with adequate numbers and resources to evangelize their own people. They still need outside cross-cultural assistance, or in other words, they still need missionaries. That means there's 2.99 billion people within those 7,000 unreached people groups that are still unreached. Not just unchurched, but unreached. It's not an issue of lostness, but an issue of access. They have no way of hearing the gospel. And every one of these people groups needs reproducing churches so that every person in that people group can have access to the gospel. And then When we talk about languages, over 1,900 languages are still waiting for a Bible translation. So let's take that research and let's put it on a map and kind of what it would look like. And we see here a map of 3 different colors. The green are showing places where the church is established and significant. The yellow shows where there's a forming or nominal church. And then the red shows where the unreached or least reached peoples are. And so we see that area of the map that is still red is an area of the world that we refer to as the 1040 window. So let's talk about the 1040 window for a moment. Almost 6,000 of those 7,000 unreached people groups live in the area of the world called the 1040 window. And that makes up about 2.91 of those 2.99 billion people that are currently living without access to the gospel. And then within the 1040 window, we have the 5 major religious blocks of unreached peoples. So if we look at a religious map of the 1040 window, we would see those 5 religious blocks. They can be remembered by the word thumb. We have the tribal, or those that practice of folk religion, Hindus, the unreligious, basically China, North Korea, and then Muslims and Buddhists. And great needs, great challenges ahead of us to finish this task of reaching the last people groups yet unreached. So let's look at some of the challenges of the remaining task. The first task is that of a spiritual challenge, or the first challenge is that of a spiritual challenge. Satan has deceived the nations through these false religions. You see the Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims. Breakthroughs among these religious blocks are tough, and they're going to demand time and prayer. But I think Satan has also deceived many in the church. I think the Great Commission has been domesticated. We emphasize the phrase making disciples in the Great Commission while ignoring the phrase of all nations. I think we've also distorted the call. We're waiting for a call instead of obeying the command that we already have, and that is to disciple all nations. And then, as we mentioned before, with the definition, the church's definition of mission becoming so broad, we're really becoming unaware of what the task actually is and how we're doing at completing that task. A second challenge of the remaining task would be the people group challenge. Many of these people groups live in areas of the world that are just isolated and remote, hard-to-access areas. Just 2 weeks ago, I was riding a motorbike with a group of people through mountains in Southeast Asia, trying to get to some villages of an unreached people group, and we could pray through those villages. Roads almost inaccessible, and this was the dry season and wet season. Almost impossible, except for by motorbike, you'd have to walk for days through mud. And then many of these people groups still with no written language and no Bible. A third challenge of the remaining task would be the political challenge. There are more martyrs in the 20th century, have been more martyrs in the 20th century than the first 19 centuries combined. And so countries with the highest number of unreached people groups tend to be those close countries with hostile governments. And so the simple fact is the people groups that are still unreached remain unreached because all of the easy ones have been taken. And then we have a financial challenge. Research tells us that of every dollar given in U.S. churches, 96 cents of that stays at home, and only 3 cents of that goes to reach peoples or the green areas on our map, and only 1 penny then goes to unreached peoples in the 1040 window. And then on top of that, we have the missionary challenge. Out of every 10 missionaries sent out by U.S. churches, only 1 goes to the 1040 window. And then I think the last challenge that we need to consider is the migration challenge. Paul, when he was speaking in Athens in Acts 17, he says that from one man, God made all nations of men and determined the exact times and places they should live so that they would seek him and find him. And people are on the move around the world, and this migration is basically happening, I think, for 2 reasons. There's a pull because of education and opportunities, the American dream, and people are also moving because of a push, because of war and persecution and disease and disasters. And so although God might not cause the evil that moves these people, he certainly works in spite of it to accomplish his purposes. And so while we must continue to send out missionaries throughout the world, we must also recognize the Great Commission opportunities here in the U.S. Many of the strangers next door to us represent some of the world's unreached and least reached peoples. Research says between 2000 and 2010, the U.S. gained some 8 million immigrants. And in 2010, immigrants made up about 14% of the U.S. population. So that means also millions of dollars every year are sent from the U.S. to majority world countries by these immigrants supporting their families. And so this brings up a couple questions. One is, could the gospel travel across the social networks of internationals living here in the U.S. to go back to their home countries, cities, towns, and villages? And the second important question then is, are we as the church equipped to reach these unreached people group communities in our own cities, and through those relationships then take the gospel back to these unreached areas? So our organization, Engage Global, is really founded as a resource to local churches to help meet these challenges of the remaining task. And so there you see our mission is really just to be a catalyst for the long-term engagement of unreached peoples around the world by providing intensive world Christian training among unreached people groups from the 1040 window that are living in the Twin Cities. And so first of all, the key there is long-term engagement. There's nothing short about the mandate that Christ gave us. And to get people engaged long-term, we provide world Christian training. And so what is a world Christian? We say world Christian is somebody who simply knows the story of the Bible and strategically lives their life as a part of that story. I think many times we study the Bible as a collection of stories, all with ending with a personal application. And although this might not be incorrect, it's certainly incomplete, because there is a thread that runs through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation that connects all those stories of the Bible into one story with one major theme. It's one story, and it's the story of God's plan to gather worshipers from all the nations that he's created. And I think every believer needs to know that story and needs to ask, what part is my part in that story? So I think many times we ask the question, what is God's will for my life? And often when we ask that question, the response is then, well, what are you good at? What are you passionate about? And so we answer the question, we start to think, well, I'm passionate about this, I like this, I'm good at this. But then who does that make the beginning point for discovering God's will for my life? It makes me the beginning point. And so then we proceed to try to fit God into our story. We kind of try to Christianize our life. So I think the first question we should ask before we ask, what is God's will for my life? The question we need to ask is, what is God's will? And as we look at the story from Genesis to Revelation, we discover that his will is that there will be worshipers in heaven from every people group, every tribe, language, tongue, and nation. And once we understand that story, then we ask the question, how does my life fit into that story? And it's no longer about trying to Christianize my life, but it's crucifying my life. So at Engage Global, we like to just say a world Christian is somebody who knows the story and lives the story. And so as a part of our training, our world Christian training, we have three components. The first component is that of education. We explore God's Word. And through the missions teaching, we want to help our participants really develop a Bible-based zeal for missions. And then we want to help them develop really an obedience-driven motive for missions involvement and a God-centered passion for the nations. And I think it really, mobilization begins here in the Word of God, and that's what separates mobilization, I think, from manipulation. So I think many times our missions appeals border on manipulation. Our missions appeals are oftentimes more needs-based and more man-centered and very guilt-driven. A second component of our World Christian Training then is exposure. We then go out and explore God's world among the unreached and among those 5 religious blocks. And through the exposure activities, we want to help our participants experience the strongholds of these major religious blocks, and then really get training on how to culturally engage followers of these religions so that they can engage them redemptively. And then to really help broaden their compassion for unreached peoples around the world. Through these exposure activities, it just helps make the unreached real. And then the third component then is engagement. It's exploring God's work. And we want to make sure that when people leave Engage Global, they not only know the story, but they're committed to discover their strategic role in that story. We want to help them figure out what are the strategic next steps in doing that. So we like to say Engage Global is a part of the process and not a destination. In other words, if you were to picture a road, a mobilization road, and the end of that road is long-term engagement of unreached peoples, I like to say Engage Global helps to get people on that road, or maybe give them a little push to help them start moving down that road. So then, we do this in the Twin Cities. So then the question is, well, why the Twin Cities? Well, let's think about the acrostic Hmong tribals. Here in the Twin Cities, we have 90,000 Hmong, tribal group from Southeast Asia. The Hmong have 2 large Hmong markets where they sell all the idols and magic rocks and charms and amulets and fetishes, all the way to the rings and the gongs and the symbols that shaman use in their spirit ceremonies. I was just recently in Southeast Asia, was in a Hmong market, and saw the same things being sold there as the market here. I was recently talking to a young Hmong guy here in Minneapolis about Hmong people, Hmong traditions, Hmong culture, and he was talking about the shaman rituals. And he says, you know, he says us young people, when it comes time for a sacrifice, he said the old people, they still go to the farm and get a chicken and pluck it, kill it and pluck it to do the sacrifice. He says, we just go to the grocery store and get a frozen chicken. So they kind of westernized their traditions. But the point is, they're still living the same worldview right here in the Twin Cities. Then the age of the Hindus. We have over 30,000 Hindus living here in the Twin Cities. We have the largest Hindu temple here in North America. Inside that temple, in the worship hall, there are 21 mini temples patterned after major temples in India that house 21 different Hindu gods and goddesses. And so there's always some type of Hindu ceremonies going on. As my Hindu friend told me, with 330 million gods and every one of them having a birthday, he said the Hindu calendar is very full. And then Muslims, we have over 150,000 Muslims. The largest Muslim people group here in the Twin Cities are the Somalis. Over 75,000 Somalis living here in this area. And so here in the Twin Cities, we have Somali museums, Somali mosques, and Somali markets. And then, of course, the Buddhists. We have 77,000 Buddhists. We have the largest Cambodian Buddhist temple here in the U.S. Idolatry, and here at that temple, they're even building a stupa to house a bone of Buddha. The head monk here at the temple in Minneapolis traveled to Sri Lanka and talked to the head monk there and has brought back a bone from Buddha, and now they're building a stupa where they will house that bone and become a very sacred place for people to come and worship. And so who can come and do and take the World Christian Training offered through Engage Global? We take high school groups, we take college groups, and many different types of adult groups. We've had adult small groups, we've had adult missions teams from local churches, we've had pastors and staff members come and all go through our training. When they come, where will we stay? We have a building here we call the Hub. It's a fourplex. The 2 units upstairs is where my family and our team members live. And then downstairs we have a guy's dorm and a girl's dorm full of bunk beds where teams will sleep. And then our hub is in an area of Minneapolis called the Phillips neighborhood. And there's about 90 different languages spoken here in our neighborhood. And then within those units where we host the teams, we also have a classroom where our teaching and instruction takes place, and then as well as a lounge and prayer room where our debriefing and prayer takes place. So what will we do? Come to Minneapolis, come to experience international missions, and come to get training, World Christian training. What will we do? Missions teaching is a big part of it. A lot of that is done through self-discovery, through actual teaching, and then through a lot of different examples and illustrations. We also do cross-cultural training. We'll do an exercise where we'll split a group into 2 different cultures. They will learn the rules of their culture, and then they will send cultural visitors and interact with one another. And the whole purpose of the exercise is to learn how do we interact successfully cross-culturally, and we debrief the activity and talk about how do we ask questions, how do we ask good cultural questions, how do we learn questions, how do we interact successfully. And we do that because then we go out and we engage people in the community, whether it's Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, tribals. We do that through temples, through temple tours, as well as going into the markets and talking to the vendors and sellers and learning culture and worldview of those people. Every day we also eat ethnic food. We eat a simple breakfast at the hub, and then we go out for lunch and dinner at ethnic restaurants. So we've got relationships with different restaurants, and they'll either set up some kind of buffet, or we might eat a family style, or we might just eat at the temple and try foods from around the world. And then we always end with a time of debrief and prayer. We'll come back and we'll talk about the exposure activity we just did. We'll talk about what we learned, what we experienced, who we talked to, what we heard, and we'll connect that to the big picture around the world. What does that mean for the big picture, but also what does that mean when you return to your home city? Just recently we had a team come up from the south, and we just received an email from one of the people on that team and said after Engage Global they went home and they met a Buddhist, and they got talking to a Buddhist. And they said, just thank you for the training that we received in Engage Global. When I went home, as I met this Buddhist, I was able to talk to them about Buddhism, and I was able to share Christ in a more contextualized way. So we'll talk about that, and once we've debriefed, then we'll go to our prayer wall, and we'll pray for unreached people groups specifically by name. So thinking about then doing a short-term exposure here in the Twin Cities. If we start thinking about the strategic factors we talked about earlier, we think about focus. Coming to the Twin Cities, you may not spend time here in a foreign country, but you will spend time in a foreign culture. And because of English spoken, the emphasis then is put on not physical needs, but spiritual needs. And I'm learning culture and seeing the spiritual need and how to speak to that. Also, then cost. Of course, being here in the Twin Cities, we've eliminated the cost of international travel, the need for passport, visa, shots, those kinds of things. Hosting, Engage Global has designed a missions experience specifically for your team in mind, and so you're not a burden, you're a blessing. You are what we're here for, is to help your group, and mobilizing your group and training your group to engage unreached peoples. And then, of course, exposure. All of our training is focused on unreached people groups from around the world. They're living here in the Twin Cities. And then the outcome then is everything we do is connected to the big picture. And going through a training then, you receive a good missions theology, a good missiology, cultural training, and understanding of world religions. And then we talk to what are the next steps then to engaging unreached peoples. And so that's what we want to see. We want to see, after teams leave here, that they take the next steps to engage unreached peoples, both in your world where everyone can make a difference, and in areas of the world where no one is making a difference. And so we kind of see ourselves as part of a process. And so we're kind of a link in a chain. And so we have some other partners a ministry called Mekong Kingdom Movements. We do an annual short-term trip to Southeast Asia as a continuation of what we've learned here, and it's done in a country where I served, so I lead, and it's not a burden or security risk to the M's, but we go and see up close and personal things that we've talked about and learned here, and it's a continuation of that. Groups like Cafe 1040, another partner, where maybe after coming to Engage Global and being awakened to the remaining task and the challenges of that task, we begin to ask the question, well, what role would I play? Maybe I should go, but could I go? And Cafe 1040 allows you to spend 3 months in the 1040 window and developing a confidence and a competence that, yes, I can live, and yes, I can live in this part of the world. I can do this. Then maybe come back and say, I need to learn. How do I plant churches cross-culturally? How do I do that? Another partner is New York City International Project. They have a 10-month church planning training in New York City called Equip, and you go and learn what does it look like to do evangelism and discipleship and church planning among an unreached people. What does it look like to put together an entry strategy and enter an unreached people group with the goal of seeing a movement happen, and you can get that training here. Kind of do here first what you have to do over there. And then, of course, 1615 is hosting this webinar as churches come and get awakened, and maybe saying, wow, how do we get our whole church on the same page and really make a strategic focus? 1615 obviously can help with that. And then other sending agencies for long-term goers, people like Pioneers and OMF International, a couple of our partners. So we, as I said, we exist as a resource for local church. We just want to help your church develop and mobilize your people for your global vision to engaging, long-term engaging of unreached peoples around the world. So, Matthew, at this point, I think I'll turn it back over to you and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Let me change the presenter here. So, Rick, while I'm waiting for some of the questions to populate the Q&A panel, and again, just want to remind you all, if you have a question for Rick, you can just type it in the question and answer panel there on the right side of your screen. Rick, one of the questions I have, obviously Engage Global has a heart to be a resource for local churches, and I really appreciate that passion that you have for the local church and providing those on-ramps right there in the Twin Cities. And maybe some of the people online today will say, hey, Rick, I want to learn more. I want to actually, develop some short-term trips to work with Engage Global. But what can they also do to identify ethnic pockets in their own surroundings? Any ideas on how some of the listeners and viewers might be able to identify cross-cultural opportunities in their own, areas of the country?
Yeah, I would just get online, look at some of the census data that's been taken. There's another website called ethnicharvest.org, I believe is the website. They've got some of that research and a lot of resources in different languages, Bibles, tracts, things like that. Also, organizations like Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, World Relief, these organizations that resettle refugees. Do they exist in your city, and have they resettled refugee communities there? And they can help you know where those refugee communities live, what neighborhoods, what the numbers, and who the different people groups are that have moved to your city. And then also looking up mosques, looking up Buddhist temples, looking up Hindu temples in your state, and see where they exist. If there's some of those temples and places of worship, then that would obviously mean there's a community there as well, as why that they have those places of worship. So those are just some of the ways that I go about and I went about finding these different communities.
That's helpful, Rick. Thank you. I might add, ethnic restaurants are a great place to start relationships, get to know people, enjoy the food, and then find out more about that ethnic group. Oftentimes, there's a larger contingency. So Josh is asking. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say International Student Incorporated also is a great place to find out what's the international student population, colleges and universities near you.
That's right. They're out there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Joshua was asking, how big of a high school group can Engage Global host?
Yeah, we've set our numbers a minimum of 8 and maximum of 18, and we do that just to maximize the experience. When we send teams out for some of the exposure activities, for instance, when they go to the market, we send them out in a group, and then at the market they've been broken down into 2, no more than 3, and we really want to make sure they have interaction, they're talking, and they're getting that type of exposure.
That's good. Gary Eberly from Pennsylvania is asking, would you say that Engage Global is a great alternative to a short-term trip for young people, teens, in particular, and why? So is this a good alternative for youth to do short-term missions, and why?
Yeah, I think I'm not saying I think it's a great, especially first step. I think you come to Engage Global first, and you get a good missions theology, you get a good missiology, you really learn what it means to be a cultural learner. And because we're doing this in a foreign culture in the U.S., many in that foreign culture, those speak English because they live in the U.S. And so, as I mentioned earlier about the Hmong market, I was just an Asian in the Hmong market, but unless you spoke Lao or Hmong, you couldn't talk to any of those people, right? But I can go to the Hmong market here, see the same things, but I can speak to everybody here, or most everybody, because they speak English. And so the learning that can be done, and the emphasis of this of learning about the spiritual need, and then then I think you get good cultural, strategical, biblical lenses through which then maybe a next step then is taking a trip overseas, but you have good lenses by which to process everything you see when you go overseas.
Right. So not necessarily an alternative, but maybe a pathway towards a deeper engagement. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. I would hesitate to say I'm not saying this replaces, or should be done in place of. But I think it maybe should be done before.
Yeah.
I think it
great point.
Yeah, it makes if we're going to spend the money, let's make sure we're well prepared.
Great point.
And making being the best steward of that money.
Luke asks, what do you mean by contextualizing the gospel, Rick?
Yeah, that can be a broad, deep subject. What we say, to make it simple, we just say, what makes the gospel good news to this people? So, in other words, the gospel is good news to a Buddhist in a different way than it is to a Muslim. So, in part of our introduction to Buddhism as we go out, we look at John 3:16 through the eyes of a Buddhist. And one of the points we make, where John 3:16 talks about having everlasting life. Well, as we know, a Buddhist believes that they have everlasting life. They're trapped in this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and they're trying to end that cycle. And so to offer a Buddhist eternal life is not that attractive. I was in Bangkok a couple years ago. Bangkok Post, English newspaper, a famous monk had just died. Just before he died, he told his followers, I won't be born again. Exactly how it was stated in the paper. Not an anti-Christian statement, but he's saying, hey, I'm finally ending this cycle. I'm ending this cycle of life. It's great. I don't have everlasting life. And so those kinds of things. So what makes the gospel good news? How do we make the gospel good news to a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim?
That's great. An illustration I've heard of that's really helpful for me is that, both hands, and you've got the essentials of the gospel, and you have a closed fist around those essentials. Those don't budge. They stay the same. But the approach by which you communicate the gospel is an open hand. There's some liberties there and freedoms, so holding fast to the essentials of the historical gospel, but the way you communicate it, the contextualization piece, looking for those bridges and those opportunities. This is another great question here. Does a mixed group of some adults and some teens work well for an engaged global experience?
Yeah, we've had some like parents of teens that have come, or adult sponsors of teens, or just adult family groups. Also, we've taken. So yeah.
Good.
That
These are real practical. A lot of interest in the opportunities that you offer, Rick. How many days is the experience, and how much does it cost per person?
Yeah, we do weekends or week-longs. In the summer, we only do week-longs. We kind of reserve summer because of vacations and out of school and those kinds of things. And so a summer would be arrive on a Wednesday afternoon and then leave on Monday morning. And that's $400 per person. And that includes housing, all the meals, training, resources, everything. And then we have a 2-night and 3-night weekend. So our 2-night weekend would be arriving on a Friday and leaving on a Sunday afternoon. And that one is $200. And then coming on a Thursday through a Sunday is $250.
Very reasonable for a really amazing experience, very viable. Here's another question. This is from Barry. Are you interested, and we've heard this question before, Rick, in expanding the training you do to include other countries? Would you partner with other missions organizations in order to expand the mission of Engage Global?
Into other countries?
Yes. Yeah, I guess the last time we had that asked, it was, would you be interested in expanding into other cities in the U.S.? But this one is saying, would you expand the concept into other countries? Yeah, we as a part of our longer vision master plan, we would like to do this in a couple other U.S. cities, and to make it more, accessible to churches. And then also, as a part of the big picture, I would love to see maybe in a couple other countries, places where other countries that are in the green, where there are a large number, the global south, where there are a large number of believers, and how can we mobilize the church there? So yes and yes, yes, both nationally and yes, internationally. So I'm in Cameroon working with the Baka people. Loaded question. So that was just a follow-up to what you just mentioned there. It's someone working in Cameroon among the Baka. Anything to add to that, Rick? Or
to mobilize among them?
Well, just it was a loaded question. He was being specific.
Oh.
He mentioned that he's working among the Baka. So.
Oh, to mobilize people specifically for the Baka people?
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
Yeah. I contact me and let's talk and what are the needs, and yeah, if I'm understanding the question right. Yeah, I'd love to highlight different unreached peoples and needs.
Okay, I'm scrolling through my questions here, folks. If you have any more to put up, please do. There's a couple I haven't hit yet, but looking for a few others to come in. Where are most of the students that go through Engage Global coming from, Rick, is one of the questions. So when you see these students come to Engage Global, where are they primarily coming from?
As far as states and locations?
I'm guessing there wasn't specifics there.
Yeah. Well, this year was our first full year of ministry, so we had 188 participants come through Engage Global this year. We had several groups from Iowa, from Kansas, I'm from Iowa and my wife's from Kansas, so that's part of it in there. This upcoming year, we have people coming from Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, New Mexico. Yeah, so they're coming from all over.
All over the place. Yeah, you mentioned New Mexico. That's one of the churches I've worked with. I think it's kind of an interesting situation. A church that 1615 coached and has helped them develop a strategic missions vision and strategy. They're working among a Muslim people group in Egypt that we can't even mention online here. And because of the very hostile situation that their missionaries are in and the limited opportunities for people in the body to engage, they are, Engage Global is their short-term missions experience because they know they just can't take large numbers to work among the missionaries in Egypt, but they want to inculcate, a passion for reaching Muslims and ongoing exposure that complements their larger vision for this particular group in Egypt. So I really love the way they partnered with you, Rick, to create, it's a pathway not to the field per se because of the nature of their work, but it's connected to their larger vision. It keeps Muslim evangelism right in front of their face. It exposes the larger body to these opportunities. And then as they come home from your trips, they're going to further, inspire the larger congregation to keep moving ahead in Muslim ministry. Yeah. So just an example of what that could look like.
I've talked to the pastor a few times. We've put together, a week of what that would look like, and we're excited to have them for next summer. So, we do a basic what we call Explore Week, and that's where we explore the thumb, biblical basis of missions, that kind of thing. This will be an Encounter the Muslim World. So this is an encounter week that we're doing at this church from New Mexico. We've also done some weekends of encountering the Buddhist world for churches maybe that are specifically focused. We had a church that's specifically focused in a country in Southeast Asia, a primarily Buddhist country, and we just kind of did a Buddhist weekend where really looked close at Buddhist worldview and culture and that kind of thing.
One question here, are the weekend and week-long trips held throughout the year or only during the summer?
No, throughout the year.
Throughout the
year, week-long are only do week-longs in the summer, but we'll do a week-long anytime during the year or weekend.
Mm-hmm. And this is from Barry. This is a great question. Does any of your training include specifics about reaching oral societies and groups? So in your worldview training and the mission stuff you do you talk about oral societies and groups?
Not any training necessarily for orality or anything like that. We discuss and some of that comes up, but we don't do any specific training that way.
Right. Yeah. Pretty hard to condense in such a short time.
Yeah, because limited time. Yeah.
There's probably an awareness piece, though, right? As they're working. Yeah. Especially if you're looking overseas, most of these are going to be oral societies.
Yeah, what we do in our market, we have two different markets that we go to, and so we'll look at Luke 10 and look at the entry strategy when Jesus sent out the 72, and then we'll watch a video, kind of a visual explanation of that strategy, what that looks like, and then we'll kind of talk through that, and then send them out to kind of, as a church planning team entering into a new people group with a lot of cultural questions to ask. So it kind of brings up the idea of church planning movements, of orality, of those kinds of things. But I think then the next step would be to go and see that on the field and see what that actually looks like. And
absolutely. Rick, I'm going to allow you to give some summary thoughts if you want to as you wrap this up, and then if everyone will just hang online, I want to do a few closing thoughts of my own and talk about some future events and resources. So Rick, any summary thoughts or encouragement for our audience?
Yeah, just again that we kind of have laid out a program, but we really want to be a resource for the church and really want to help you as a church mobilize your people, help get them on the same page biblically, missiologically, so that makes your job of mobilizing them for the particular vision for the globe that God has given your church. And so we want to really come alongside you, whatever. So feel free to give me a call and talk through some of that, what that looks like. Yeah, I'm available. I'd love to talk and see how we can serve.
That's great. I want to mention, in connection to that, Rick, I've done a lot of short-term trips over the years. I was a missions pastor at a very large church, and we took thousands literally overseas on short-term missions, and a lot of great work happened, and there was a lot of life trajectory changing. You know, God changed directions and created some wonderful things and a lot of transformation. So I don't want to minimize it at all, but I didn't have an opportunity like this, and I wish I did at the time, because I eventually incorporated something similar. Before our short-term teams would hit the streets, as it were, we would do 2 or 3 days in country to do kind of a cultural observation, and we would send them out as learners, and we'd have questions that they would ask people, and then we'd regroup with this teams, and we would say, based upon your learnings over the next 2 or 3 days, how has your approach changed from when you originally came in field? You know, the thoughts of how you were going to engage. And as I hear about this, I'm just thinking, before you send someone on an extended short-term mission trip, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in Asia, wherever, go here first, or something like this, because it will shape the way they actually do ministry when they're in field. I think we go to the field and we have these ideas about what we're going to do, but we're just not prepared for the challenges of cross-cultural ministry, spiritually or even practically. And I would just say that an experience like this would maximize the potential of a real short-term trip overseas. So I just want to reinforce that. I think it's just such a great offering, and I love your heart for the church. A couple of closing things here as we wrap up this time together. Again, a reminder that the Reduced Conference is archived online. It is free content. There's about 5 different talks, some of what you even heard today would be emphasized in those talks. A really great conference, and we just want to make that available to you. And once again, we have all types of resources, not just webinars, many other resources on our site that are free. If you want to know more about the ministry of 1615 and church missions coaching and how can we help your church unleash its potential, please contact us on our website. And there's emails there as well. And then I'm going to leave this screen up here just for a few seconds. This is direct contact info for 1615. And also Rick Davis at Engage Global. It's got his email, my email, addresses, physical addresses, and so forth and so on. So again, I want to thank the audience for tuning in today. I hope this has been a blessing to you. It certainly is a blessing to 1615 to serve the body of Christ. Rick, thank you again for giving us your time and sharing with us today, and I hope some meaningful connections come out of this. I am confident that the things you shared will be useful to those who heard them. So I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thank you for listening, and Merry Christmas to everybody. God bless you.
Thanks.